Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you. Welcome along to Temenos, particularly to those people who perhaps have never been to a Temenos Academy event before. My name is Ian Skelly and I'm the chairman of the Temenos Academy, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers tonight. In my day job, I'm a broadcaster, and a long time ago now, I used to work when I first started in my so-called career in BBC local radio, and I was up in the Midlands on a radio station one afternoon presenting a radio programme, and there was an earthquake, which is quite substantial, and I thought a bomb had gone off. It was also rather alarming because every other member of staff in the radio station ran out of the building and left me on the radio on my own. Anyway, in that particular part of the world, it was a very well-known event, and it was rather like the death of Kennedy, really. Everyone remembered where they were when the earthquake happened. And I was down in South Shropshire a few days later, and I got lost, and I stopped and asked a farmer for directions, and inevitably the conversation came round to this earthquake. And it was near a place called Nuckless, which has an old castle on the hill. And there's an old legend there about the fact that Arthur, actually I think it was Uther Pendragon, buried the red and the black dragon under the castle. And when I said to this farmer, "Where were you on the day of the earthquake?" he said with total conviction, it wasn't an earthquake, it was the dragons roaring. And me being a bit of an urbanite, humoured him, and he said, "You mark my words, within a year there'll be a war." And within 6 months, the first Gulf War broke out. And I found myself reflecting when that happened on that farmer's conviction. It was the first time I'd ever come across anybody who lived the myth and had within him an understanding of the symbolism of the earth that he was very hefted to, as indeed every generation of his family had been for many years. And that's really the subject that we're going to be talking about this evening, or listening to two eminent experts on the subject. They're going to kind of run it themselves, really. There will be opportunities for questions at the end. When I was talking to Graham earlier, he said he felt that really he should go first because he's the junior member of the team. I'm not sure how that makes Kevin feel, but Kevin Crossley-Holland is, as you may well know, a very eminent poet and author, well-known children's author, award-winning. One of his books, The Seeing Stone, won the Guardian Children's Fiction Award, and also the Smarties Bronze Medal. I trust the tube of Smarties was sufficiently large. But in the grown-up world, he's tremendously eminent indeed as the translator of Beowulf, and also the author of the Book of Norse Myth and British Folk Tales. And he's going to be talking about Norse myth and the motifs that you find there. In the red corner, we have Graham Davis, who is himself another poet and author. I'm sure he would prefer that I described him as a Welsh poet. In a former life, he worked himself at the BBC and was rather senior in BBC management and news in the BBC in Wales, which is a very brave thing to do for a poet, I would suggest. Strikes me a sort of modern-day example of Dante in hell, but there we are. He survived that. He survived that and became an author and poet. He's published over 17 books in both English and Welsh, and collections of poetry as well. And he's going to be giving his thoughts on motifs to be found in the literature of the Celtic tradition that, of course, converged on these islands just as the Norse one did as well. So it should be a very interesting and provocative evening, I'm sure. I'm going to be quiet now and hand you on to our first speaker, Graham Davis.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. And it's actually rather nice to be a junior anything at my time of life. I was quite flattered to be described as a junior partner. That's very encouraging. And an earthquake and a dragon and a prophecy of war. That's quite a hard act to follow. So I hope you don't find this material too tame in comparison. although it is very much a personal response to the body of Celtic myth. Now, through my own occasional attendance at Temenos Academy meetings, I've learned that the Temenos is a sacred place where the human can meet the divine, and a place of significance, encounter, and exchange. Now, the divine is obviously beyond all definition, but it's nonetheless inevitably experienced through the prism of human culture. And in his great poem about his own Temenos, Little Gidding, T.S. Eliot evoked a place charged with spiritual potential, with a specifically English character, the product of centuries of tradition. However, Eliot knew and said this was only one way of experiencing the divine through place. He readily acknowledged that, as he said, there are other places which also are the world's end. And I'm sure we all have our own places where our worlds end and others begin. So I want to share a little about my own place and my own Celtic tradition, and to show how this mythology is still very much a living tradition, a timeless source of wisdom, enlightenment, and inspiration. I must stress, however, I'm not a scholar of Celtic myth. My academic specialisms are in other areas, so I'll be recounting mainly experience. But Celtic mythology has been part of my worldview and my resources as a writer all my life, and if nothing else, at least I hope I can testify to the value, the power, and the continued relevance of the Celtic cultures of these islands. So I was born in a village called Coedpoeth, a few miles west of Wrexham in North Wales. The village sat on Offa's Dyke itself, at a place called Adwyr Clawdd, which means the gap in the dyke, where the old Drovers Road from the Cheshire Plain passed through on its way to the Berwyn Mountains. And it was a geographical border, a political border, a cultural and a linguistic border. And I was fortunate to belong to the quarter or so of the villagers who spoke the Welsh language. And I grew up with one language for the narrow, intimate, familiar streets of a mountain village, and another for the wider world of the seemingly endless plains to the east. But I don't want to stress the exceptional at the expense of the everyday. This was no cultural ghetto. The dominant influences in my life were the same as for most other British children my age. It was just that the Celtic culture provided a path, as though through a gap in the dyke, to an older and very different world. Because if we cross that border, we find a bardic tradition going back over 1,000 years and a living system of symbols that can speak to us today. In October last year, I attended a talk here about Coleridge by my friend Malcolm Guite. And Malcolm asked a question to the audience, what we might want to say to our 16-year-old selves. Now, that's an intriguing question. And in my case, I have a pretty good idea of the answer, because when I was 16, somebody said exactly the right thing to me. So I mentioned that I was lucky as a child to get the language. I was lucky too, at that age of 16, to meet one of its most distinguished practitioners, the poet Brian Martin Davies, twice winner of the National Eisteddfod crown. Then, in 1980, he was about the age I am now, and at the height of his powers. He was the Welsh teacher in my sixth form college in Wrexham, the first poet I'd ever met, and he looked and sounded the part, saturnine, intense, with a gruff, tobacco-roughened, Burton-esque South Wales voice, in which he set out for me the strange, beautiful, and troubling stories and characters of the Mabinogion. Now, I'd known some of these ancient stories since primary school, but now they came alive. Now, the Mabinogion, or more correctly, Mabinogi, is the body of prose stories surviving mainly in Welsh manuscripts of the 14th and 15th centuries, but compiled a couple of centuries earlier, and clearly based on still earlier material, some of it apparently pre-Christian. It's a rich mixture of enchantment, quest, war, love, and betrayal. and it's the product of a highly developed literary culture. Among its characters are Rhiannon, Pwyll, the Prince of Dyfed, Culhwch, and Olwen, and, of course, King Arthur. It was translated into English first by Lady Charlotte Guest in the mid-19th century, and the Mabinogion is available now in various translations and has proved a source of imagery and inspiration to writers, folklorists, and students of mythology around the world. For Brian Martin Davies, though, these stories and their characters were not merely antiquarian curiosities. They provided a symbolic language for his own worldview and his own profound engagement with the challenges of life. His 1972 sequence, A Golau Caeth, The Captive Light, which won him the National Eisteddfod crown, used the Mabinogi imagery in a striking contemporary way. And a decade later, I can recall the thrill of hearing him read a poem from that book. It was called Efnisien. Now, Efnisien's a personal name. Who was he? He appears in the second branch of the Mabinogi, the story of Branwen Ferch Llyr, the daughter of Lear. Branwen is the sister of Bendigeidfran, the giant, Bran the Blessed, the king of Britain. They have two half-brothers, Efnisien and his twin, Nisien. Nisien is good, but Efnisien is, of course, the evil twin. He's one of the more intriguing anti-heroes in medieval literature. He's sometimes compared to Loki as a trickster and has been characterized as a sadistic psychopath, with good reason. Because in the story, when Branwen is betrothed to Matholwch, the king of Ireland, in a peacemaking dynastic marriage, Efnisien, in a fit of rage at not having been consulted on the match, mutilates the Irish king's stabled horses, thereby endangering the alliance. Matholwch is eventually pacified with gifts from the British, including the priceless Cauldron of Rebirth, which can revive any dead person put into it. And he returns to Ireland with Branwen as his bride. But the insult still rankles, and he's persuaded to mistreat her. Branwen alerts her brother, who invades Ireland by wading across the sea. The Irish, overawed, sue for peace and hold a feast of reconciliation. During this, the suspicious Efnisien discovers treachery in the form of 100 Irish warriors concealed in sacks of flour, ready to ambush the Britons. He kills them quietly by crushing their skulls by hand. Then, in the hall, he asks to see his nephew, Gwern, the son of Branwen and Matholwch, so that he can greet him. The little boy is set before him, and here, in Lady Charlotte Guest's translation, is what happened. "By my confession to heaven," said Efnisien in his heart, "unthought of by the household is the slaughter that I will this instant commit." Then he arose and took up the boy by the feet, and before anyone in the house could seize hold of him, he thrust the boy headlong into the blazing fire. And when Branwen saw her son burning in the fire, she strove to leap into the fire also, from the place where she sat between her two brothers. But Bendigeidfran grasped her with one hand and his shield with the other. So, war breaks out. The Irish, of course, use the Cauldron of Rebirth to revive their dead so the Britons cannot prevail. Seeing this, Efnisien repents, and he says, "Alas, woe is me, that I should have been the cause of bringing the men of the island of the mighty into so great a strait. Evil betide me if I find not a deliverance therefrom." So he conceals himself among the Irish dead, is thrown into the cauldron, and then bursts it apart, dying himself in the process. The 7 survivors of the British expedition return sadly to Britain with Branwen. Making landfall on Anglesey by the banks of the River Allow, Branwen dies of heartbreak at the losses of which she has been the cause, and she's buried there in a 4-sided grave. The 7 survivors journey on, staying first for 7 years at Harlech, comforted by the song of the birds of the goddess Rhiannon. They then spent 80 years on the island of Gwales, comforted likewise and forgetful of their sorrow, until one of them finally opens a forbidden door facing Cornwall. Their losses and griefs come flooding back, and they have to leave, finally reaching London and burying Bendigeidfran's head under the White Hill, now known as the Tower of London, where its presence will forever protect the land from invasion. All of that tragedy thanks to Efnision's irrational evil. So, here is Brian Martin's poem, Efnisien, first in Welsh, so that anyone familiar with what we call the language of heaven can at least hear the sound of it. Then in English. It's not a very long poem. Efnisien. Ti yw teyrn y trawster sy'n llechu yn ein celloedd. Arglwydd yr anrhigaredd a liwia gymydau tywyll y galon, gynhaliwr y garwedd sy'n clera llysoedd ein hymwybod a'i gerddi chwith. Nia adweinwn dy law, a rwyga weflau oddi wrth ddanedd, clistiau oddi wrth bennau a rhawn oddi ar gefnau. Grefftwr galanas a siddad y fysedd dir drwy esgyrn ein pennau hyd at graidd yr ymenydd noeth. Nia adweinwn nerth dy fraich, a gymer fab ein creigarwch herwydd ei draed a'i hyrddio i dan, a dir y pair iachusol yn bedwar drill, ac a gloddir bedd petrial ar lan alaw ein tristwch, lle cleddir y glendid. Ni ath adweinwn Efnisien, artist pob anffurf, gelyn pob goleuni gwyn. You are the emperor of the evil, concealed within ourselves, Lord of the callousness that governs the dark comets of the heart, sustainer of the spite that serenades the courts of our consciousness with its sadistic songs. We know your hand that tears the lips from the teeth, the ears from the head, and the mane from the back. Craftsman of catastrophe whose steel fingers sink through the bone of our skulls to the root of the bare brain. We know the strength of your arm that grasps by his feet the child of our creativity and flings him to the flame, that shatters the healing cauldron in 4 shards, and that opens the 4-sided grave on the banks of the Alaw of our grief, where purity is buried. We know you, Efnisien, artist of every deformity, enemy of all blessed light. So Brian Martin, troubled by late 20th century angst, personal, cultural, and societal, found in this figure from our early literature a potent symbol. As I heard him read that poem, I knew I wanted to be like him. So I served an informal bardic apprenticeship with him until well into my 20s. Now I can see what a privilege this was. Brian Martin had himself learned from the early 20th century poets Gwenallt and Sir T.H. Parry Williams, the latter of whom had himself learned from Sir Edward Anwyl and Sir John Rhys, the great 19th century Oxford Celtic scholar, and so on back through the centuries. A tradition stretching back to the time of the Mabinogi itself, and even beyond that. The earliest Welsh extant poetry has roots in the 7th century. So I was taught how to handle language, and more importantly, how to see. I can recall spending hours out in nature in my own Temenos, a place called Pantywyll, the dark hollow between my village and the mountain beyond. I was trying to enter the scene, the spirit of the place. One night, looking down from the mountain onto where the lights of Brumbo steelworks were glowing like coals, I can recall the sobering realization. To be this open, to be this vulnerable, was going to hurt. The following day, I asked Brian Martin, apprehensively, does a poet have to suffer? Knowing what the only answer would be. I wanted to be a poet and to be published by the house which had published Brian Martin, and that happened in 1997, and I dedicated my first volume to him. Looking back at it now, I find how I used imagery from the Mabinogi, Efnisien, the cauldron of rebirth, quite unself-consciously, knowing that my audience would understand the references, even if coded and adapted, a measure, if one were needed, of the continued vitality of that shared tradition. My second volume, Cadwyni Rhyddid, Chains of Freedom from 2002, had an extended sequence based on the Troubles in Northern Ireland. of which I'd had some brief experience as a journalist, and it used the story of Branwen as its framework. Also in 2002, together with Brian Martin's other poetic pupil, Elin ap Howell, for whom the imagery of the Mabinogi is also an essential part of her work, we dedicated to him a joint volume in Welsh and English parallel text called Ffiniau, Borders, a reference to our shared background in the border area. And we travelled up from South Wales, where we lived at that time, to the north to ask him to accept the dedication. And this was a conscious, ritual acknowledgement of our debt. In 2003, when he was 70, I arranged with our publisher to bring out his collected poems. This was an acknowledgement of the importance of his role in my life. I saw him only once more. Hearing he had moved back south, not far from where I now live, I visited with my eldest daughter, herself now a poet, so she could meet the man who had inspired me and could encounter the tradition of which she is herself a part. By this time, Brian Martin, overwhelmed by illness and personal sorrow, had been a recluse for some 20 years, although his voice retained the same thrilling quality that had made poetry come alive for me 30 years earlier. I was glad I made the effort. Brian Martin died only 3 months ago, at the age of 84. His work, of course, will live on, as will his legacy and the tradition of which it was such a fine expression. So I hope that this is some indication of the way that this mythology is still very much a living tradition. It might not be conducted in a sacred grove, but it finds its sacred space wherever there are people prepared to seek, to attend, and to learn. And in that space, a golai caeth, the captive light, can still be found. So I'm going to conclude with an example of what I mean. In 2010, both my father and my father-in-law died within 5 months of one another. During my father-in-law's last few weeks that spring, the days had seemed to be filled with the song of blackbirds. His favourite birds, and those, too, of my daughter, of his daughter, my wife Sally, who's here tonight. The presence of these birds were so striking, their song so omnipresent, that my wife asked me to look up the symbolism of the blackbird, which I did. The blackbird is, of course, the bird of Rhiannon, whom I mentioned earlier, the bird which consoles the sorrowing, and the only bird which can pass between this world and Annwn, the other world. My father-in-law died on May Eve, the day before the Celtic feast of Beltane. At such a time, of course, friends and neighbours help out. They visit. They bring food. So a few days after my father-in-law's death, Sally called to return a casserole dish to one such friend, the poet, Morgan Francis. After she'd handed over the dish to him on the door, Morgan asked her to wait. He went back into the house and returned to put a gift into her hands, asking, "Do you think the children might like this?" Sally looked at it and answered, "I think I might like it." This was a blackbird's nest. Now, Morgan had known nothing of the role blackbirds had played in my father-in-law's last days, or of their significance to Sally. The nest had been abandoned in his garden because of the unwanted attentions of a neighbour's cat. And he'd thought it might be useful for the nature table in my wife's school. So we still have it, a symbol of benign synchronicity. So that, and many other experiences like that, was to me a confirmation of there being a pattern, a purpose and a personality behind the material externals of our lives. It was, as you could imagine, a great consolation. It had come through Celtic mythology, which is, of course, not the only gate to the other world. Merely, as Eliot said, there are other places, which also are the world's end. But in explaining how and what that tradition has meant for me, I can only express the hope that we can all find our own pathways, our own gateways, and our own answers. So I'll finish with a poem I wrote based on this experience, again in Welsh. I'll read the first stanza in Welsh and then the poem in English. It's called Beltane Blackbird. Ni phrofaes rioed fis mai mor oer a hyn, y gwyntwr dwyrain dros y caeau cryn, yn fferi bysedd garddwr wrth ei waith ar heilwen yn ymguddio tu hwnt i'r bryn. I never thought to see so cold a May. The slow, insistent east wind every day makes fingers stiff as winter at their work, and sunlight seems another world away. You might have known it colder years ago, some faded snap of 1960s snow. I could have turned to ask you as we talked. It was the kind of thing you used to know. The hardened soil is heavy on the spade. The ice is still unmelted in the shade, where every broken branch and blade of grass, the frost, like February, has Fabergé'd. No birds this morning on the fencing wire, only a single blackbird on the briar. The song you always said you waited for will be for us each May a Beltane fire. That unshared bottle of your best Bordeaux, the things we should have said and yet we know, they do not matter now the blackbird sings. Welcome the green and let the winter go. Well, thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr. It's now my privilege to hand over to Kevin Crossley-Holland.
That wonderful web of sound in this poem. Welsh sound. It's terrific. Thank you, Graham. What did I do with my water? Thanks, here. Thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, dear creatures, I think probably when one gets to the age of 75, which came about last weekend, so also one resigns oneself to being a senior partner. And that's how it is. This is, however, Graham's and my second outing under the auspices of Anglia Ruskin University, and more especially of Mick Gower. He and I gave a reading at Pembroke College in Cambridge as part of the Festival of Ideas a couple of years ago. So it's a pleasure to run to a second occasion. When I was 19 and everything was fleeting and little seemed impossible, I borrowed a car well before I'd passed my driving test, beetled over Snowdonia, grazed a sheep, and paid a pilgrimage to the first poet to set me on fire, R.S. Thomas. Later, I became his editor at the publishing house of Macmillan. Life is not hurrying on to a receding future, nor hankering after an imagined past. It is the turning aside, like Moses, to the miracle of the lit bush, to a brightness that seemed as transitory as your youth once, but is the eternity that awaits you. Thomas wrote a wonderful poem called Arrival, about how, without being conscious that he'd been seeking for it, a traveller comes upon a village in the Welsh hills that shows him who he is, a traveller who's arrived after long journeying where he began, catching this one truth by surprise, that there is everything to look forward to. Fired by the miracle of the lit bush and recognizing that I'd found something I didn't know I'd been seeking, these two elements are precisely what underlay my own immediate engagement with Anglo-Saxon poetry. Both my parents, followers of Ouspensky, had, so to speak, tilled me. The very first words in my father's Music in Wales, published in 1948, he edited it and wrote the first chapter. The birds of Rhiannon sang to the 7 warriors of the island of the mighty. A certain song, and all the songs they'd ever heard were unpleasant compared thereto. And the singing was so sweet that the warriors remained spellbound for 80 years. 80 years together, listening to the birds. Accompanying himself on his Welsh harp, my father often told Celtic and more especially Welsh folk tales to my sister and me as we lay between waking and sleep on our bunk bed. When, as a teenager, I began to take a serious interest in being ordained, his and my mother's response was to introduce me to the other world religions and philosophies, more especially those of Gurdjieff and Krishnamurti. And it was my mother who dispatched me to a high village in the Alps to meet the philosopher, traveller, and sportswoman Ella Maillard. Some of you will doubtless know the book that she wrote called Forbidden Journey, after a journey across the north of Tibet with Peter Fleming, Ian Fleming's older brother. I won a place at St Edmund Hall to read English on the strength of being a tennis-playing ordinand. Many the doors long since locked and bolted, only to fail my Anglo-Saxon prelims. But I'd already begun to translate the attractive metaphorical riddles, and I was drawn by poems like Deor that contain memories of mythical figures such as Wayland the Smith. And I was thrilled by passages in the elegiac poems in which their poets are searching for their place in this world, aware that nothing truly worthwhile is ever easily won. Forth on nu, min huge huerveth o vergrethelookan, min montsefa mid meraflode o verwales ethel huerveth wide. My mind, my heart leaps within me. My mind roams with the waves over the whale's domain. It wanders far and wide across the face of the earth, returns again to me, eager and unsatisfied. The solitary bird screams, irresistible, urges the heart to the whale's way over the stretch of the seas. Like Graham, I'm not by profession a student of myth, and I'm not a folklorist either. Rather, I'm a poet, translator, and author for children who has from the first been influenced by myth and folktale, by history and by place. Covered in cigarette ash, holes in his pockets, wrinkled and crumpled, maybe it never really does to meet one's heroes. It was W.H. Auden who first counselled me to immerse myself in the early literature of the North. The myths, the skaldic poems, the sagas, the heroic legends. I did, and I was stunned. Above all, I was fascinated by the myths, for which our main, though by no means only source, is Snorri Sturluson in his Prose Edda. What a man he was, historian, biographer, poet, mythologist, politician, lawgiver at the Althing, a position equivalent to that of the Speaker of the House of Commons. Well, yes, John Bercow. In his racy, ice-bright account of the creation and cosmology of the tricentric universe, with its axis of a mighty ash tree, Yggdrasil, and in his account of the activities and relationships of the gods and goddesses, the giants and dwarves and spirits and animals, Snorri naturally brings into play all kinds of familiar motifs. Graham has spoken of Efnisien in the Mabinogion, and his Norse counterpart, though I'm not sure that I go quite as far as sadistic psychopath, at least in the first instance, is Loki, the trickster, the yeast in the mix of the myths. The deities and dwarves and giants are relatively static. Shape-shifting Loki is not. As Snorri says, he's handsome and fair of face, but has an evil disposition, and is very changeable of mood. He excelled all men in the art of cunning, and he always cheats. To begin with, Loki helps the gods out of the difficulties into which he has plunged them. But his jealousy and spleen grow, and it's he who guides the mistletoe dart that kills the most virtuous of all the gods, Balder. By no means confined to Celtic and Norse mythology, the anarchic trickster is a figure very much alive and kicking, and in one form or another present in contemporary culture. Not long ago, I collaborated with the distinguished artist Norman Ackroyd in an attempt to portray the moody, beautiful, dangerous, shape-changing salt marshes of North Norfolk in an embodied form, moored man. This short poem, Trickster, forms part of that sequence, as though he were the son of apparent light and the mimic jay. He quivers and glares, he unrolls carpets of sticky mud, then spits laughter as he laces fine sand with pointed stones. And as though he were screaming quicksilver, he rises to the moon, drags the lumpen tides until the creek's swollen and impassable. But tricksters turn to darkness. He licks oozing blood, rubs salt into wounds. He cracks and snaps bones. In the evening he drowns little children, and then he howls with remorse. Old and wild and angry, child of mayhem, father of grief. It isn't too difficult to isolate motifs, in some instances common to both mythologies, that continue to influence writers, artists, composers, craftsmen, thinkers, naturalists, students. There's the tree of life, the green growth without which there cannot be life here on earth. Yggdrasil is a timeless tree, an evergreen ash. It has one root in each of the three worlds, and Snorri says its branches spread out over the whole world and reach up over heaven. Known as the guardian tree, Yggdrasil nourishes and suffers from all the animals and birds and insects and so on that inhabit it. The three Norns, or goddesses of destiny, sit beside one root. And bearing in mind maybe that Christianity came very late to Northern Europe, Odin hangs on the tree for 9 nights, his side gashed with a spear, in order to learn the wisdom of the dead. There's the ring, the gold ring cursed by the dwarf Andvari, which passes from him to Loki, to Odin, to Fafnir, to Sigurd, and is central to the work of Richard Wagner and J.R.R. Tolkien. Sigurd, the Volsung, later called Siegfried, was himself to the northern world, as Arthur has been to the British Isles and France and Germany, the magnet of many unrelated stories. This is the great story of the North, said William Morris, after he'd translated the Volsunga Saga, which should be to all our race what the tale of Troy was to the Greeks. To all our race first, and afterwards, when the change of the world has made our race nothing more than a name of what has been, a story too, then it should be to those that come after us no less than the tale of Troy has been to us. The trickster, the tree, the ring. What other motifs in the myths have continuing power? Well, the stars, and especially the evening star, or Vandil, that's to say, Regal in Orion, which was a frozen human toe thrown by Thor into high heaven. The Anglo-Saxon for this star is Earendel, And Tolkien said that when he first heard the lines Eala Earendel, Engla beochtest overmidden monum sended, Hail Earendel, brightest of stars sent to men across Middle-earth, they invoked in him a curious thrill, as if something had stirred in me, he said, half wakened from sleep. And Earendel is the subject of one of his earliest poems. Yes, and more besides, birdsong and the ability to understand it, the cauldron in Celtic of rebirth, in Norse of wisdom and the gift of poetry, the supernatural female warriors known as shield girls or Valkyries. And then there's the dragon, the enemy of all enemies, the ultimate challenge confronted by many a hero in children's books. Not that everyone has seen him like that. In the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf, for which there are, of course, many partial analogues, there's all the difference in the world between the monsters Grendel and his mother, who are the seed of Cain, effectively humans gone wrong, and the dragon, who is the embodiment of time that we may defeat by winning a reputation that survives us, but will also defeat each one of us. Many of you must know Tolkien's unforgettable words, for which the title of our event this evening comes. If the funeral of Beowulf moved once like the echo of an ancient dirge, far off and hopeless, it is to us as a memory brought over the hills, an echo of an echo. It is written in a language that after many centuries still has essential kinship with our own. It was made in this land and moves in our northern world beneath our northern sky. And for those who are native to that tongue and land, it must ever call with a profound appeal until the dragon comes. When the dragon comes, he comes after the Axe Age and the Sword Age, the Wind Age and the Wolf Age, in the form of Ragnarok, the destruction of the powers, the apocalyptic final battle in which all created beings destroy one another and the 9 worlds are submerged. There could not be a motif, an archetype, more pertinent to our own time. And yet, 2 humans will hide themselves within Yggdrasil, Lif and Lifthrasir. Surt's fire will not scorch them, it will not even touch them. And their food will be the morning dew. Through the branches, through the leaves, they will see light come back. Lif and Lifthrasir will have children. Their children will bear children. There will be life and new life, life everywhere on earth. That was the end. And this is the beginning. One can point to very good or even great literature, music and painting, rooted in or drawing on Nordic mythology. Thomas Gray's The Fatal Sisters and Sigurd the Volsung by William Morris, and Arthur Rackham's unforgettable illustrations for the Ring Cycle. W.H. Auden's Journey to Iceland and Louis MacNeice's Iceland. Stirring novels by Cecilia Holland and Henry Treece and Rosemary Sutcliffe. Seamus Heaney's North and Bonehouse, and more recently the fine poet John Greening's Valhalla and the Norns. Joanne Harris's novel, The Gospel of Loki, and A.S. Byatt's novel again, Ragnarok, one in a series of short novels reinterpreting bodies of myth. Another, White Ravens, engaging with the Mabinogion, is by Owen Shears. Paintings by Burne Jones and Paul Nash, maybe. Compositions by Grieg and Elgar and the laureate Judith Weir, and the magnificent work, and the oratorio, The Dream of Baldur, by the fine younger composer Bernard Hughes. All this, let alone the magnificent work produced in Scandinavia itself, and whatever we conceive of as the wider Nordic world. There's been an increase in the number of translators of the mythological and heroic poems that comprise the Elder Edda, including very good recent ones by Andy Orchard and Carolyn Larrington. And yet, as I write this, I feel as if I'm almost pleading that artists should more often look north, and that any Nordic revival since Wagner and the jingoism he inspired in Germany in the 1920s and 30s has been no more than sporadic and largely limited to fantasy literature and film, including the highly popular Thor series based on the Marvel Comics character, still in the making. In fact, we're now promised, or is it threatened, with a third film, Thor Ragnarok, at the end of 2017. The truth is that within the British Isles, at least, there's by no means a substantial body to compare with that generated by the Arthurian legends. Some of them, of course, as Graham was saying, descended from the Mabinogion in the 19th and early 20th century. Tennyson, Idylls of the King, Arnold, Tristram and Isolde, William Morris again, Swinburne, Edward Arlington Robinson. Too good a poet to be widely popular, said Robertson Davies, and too good to be forgotten. Charles Williams, James Archer, Holman Hunt, J.W. Waterhouse, Frederick Sands, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Aubrey Beardsley, Arnold Bax at Tintagel. A mountaintop, an avalanche, an earthquake, a flood, a mighty wind. Yes, these are places and events where the human may meet the divine. And let's not forget the daily pointers, first names, the days of the week. But I want to return to the matter of place. Graham's spoken movingly of Pantúil, his own Temenos. And I've written of mine, the tidal island of Scald Head off the North Norfolk coast. It's a crossing place, and I've been spellbound by it since I was a small boy. Places that matter a very great deal to us become much larger than they are, because they occupy such an area of thought and emotion and memory and dream. As a teenager, I discovered a secret meadow in the Alps, a borderland between the human and the divine, and it turns out I've never left it. La Plaine de la Madeleine. Well above the hamlet, on its tipsy ledge, there was a meadow. One path scrambled up to it. It was passionate with wildflowers and unvisited, innocent of whatever was happening below. On hands and knees, I crawled along the side where you could drop off the edge of the world. Long ago, waking hot and hectic, or shocked by some dream, I used to splash my face with water, biting as a mountain stream, lie back, and climb that rocky path again. Turbaned lily, gentian, orange poppy, soldanella, names I no longer remember. Each breathing midnight now, unsure I'll return. I realize I'm doing the same. I'll do the same. Pantúil and Scald Head and La Plaine de la Madeleine are actual places. It's David Jones who reminds and shows us that each place and every place is charged with time and memory, and each waits on you and me, unhurrying, to reveal its divine spark. In an essay entitled The Myth of Arthur, in his Epoch and Artist, 1959, Jones writes, to conserve, to develop, to bring together, to make significant for the present what past holds, without dilution or any deleting, but rather by understanding and transubstantiating the material. This is the function of genuine myth. Neither pedantic nor popularizing, nor indifferent to scholarship, but saying always, of these thou hast given me, have I lost none. So here are the last lines of Jones's The Sleeping Lord. Yet he sleeps on. Very deep is his slumber. How long has he been, the sleeping Lord? Do the small black horses grass on the hunch of his shoulders? Are the hills his couch, or is he the couchant hills? Are the slumbering valleys him in slumber? Are the still undulations the still limbs of him sleeping? Is the configuration of the land the furrowed body of the Lord? Are the scarred ridges his dented greaves? Do the trickling gullies yet drain his hog wounds? Does the land wait the sleeping Lord? Or is the wasted land that very Lord who sleeps? Thank you all so much.
Kevin, thank you very much indeed. Absolutely provocative thoughts and ideas throughout both of those talks there. I don't want to say too much because what I'd really like to do is to encourage a little bit of a dialogue between the two of you, it's possible, first of all, and then open up the discussion to the floor, or more to the point, if you have any questions, then maybe you'd like to put them there. Graham, you sat listening attentively to what Kevin said. Have you any thoughts about what you've heard?
Well, I was wondering, really, listening to that, Kevin, I was struck your upbringing seems to have been more Welsh than mine. Nobody ever played a Welsh harp to me when I was growing up. It puts my background to shame. What did you think of it? How did you respond to it? Did it seem natural or strange, and how did it relate to the Norse background when you were introduced to that Celtic material?
Can everyone hear us all right
Yes,
with this? Yeah, that's good. Good. I realized, perhaps not then, but later, that the folk tales of the English, and especially the east of England, where I live with my half Welsh, half Norwegian American wife, Minnesotan wife, that they are on the whole hairy and boggarty and close to the earth. And it's the Celtic folk tales that have such wonderful flights of the imagination. And I think my father began to point that out to me, not least by improvising on the Welsh harp as he went along. The Norse myths were still a long way ahead. I was really, I think, you're right. I mean, brought up on a diet of Celtic stories. And my father went to live in Llandyssil near Llangela. So there's always been that strand. Were you aware of Norse myths when you were growing up?
Only through the Marvel comics, I'm afraid. Yes. I think that was an introduction, that first generation of those Thor comics. And I read them in children's versions, as I did Greek myths. I'm not sure that I had a sense of cultural connection with them. I felt with the Celtic mythology, I knew, even though they were introduced in children's versions, I knew that they belonged to me. I knew they were part of my story. And I felt there was a domesticity and a familiarity about them which I simply took for granted, whereas everything else was exotic.
I suppose it's true that for probably everyone in this room, that there have been moments that either there and then or post hoc you knew were turning points in your lives in terms of meeting someone or hearing something. And actually, I mean, it was Auden who did the trig. I'd met him 3 times, once at the Ilkley Festival and once in London. And can't remember where the third meeting was, but in any case, I threw over my job as editorial director of Victor Gollancz with all my friends thinking I'd completely taken leave of my senses, with 2 sons at boarding school, and went off to Iceland and began to immerse myself in the myths. So that was one of those moments, rather like when you first met and went into an apprenticeship.
Well, in terms of the parallels between the 2 mythologies, I mean, do you see certain symbols? Obviously, you've both talked about birdsong as being very symbolic. I wonder, is there an equivalent of the ash tree in the Mabinogion stories at all? And if there isn't, why do you suppose there is that absence there?
Well, it's possibly because the Norse body of myth survived longer before the advent of Christianity. So what we see in the Mabinogion is Christianized, and it's viewed through that prism, and you see shadows of a pre-Christian, cosmology would be too large, but a mythology. You see shadows of that, which have survived into a later, much more literate, much more Christian period. So I think that's possibly one reason. Thinking of that question of tree imagery, of course, probably the closest thing we have is the oak tree, and but this is oak trees collectively rather than as one giant all-encompassing symbol. The oak tree being, of course, the sacred tree of the Druids, and the word which gives the Celtic word whose roots gives you the word Druid, and also it's Derwen in Welsh. For the single, Derry plural, the same word as you have in Londonderry. It's the same. It's the oak tree. So I don't believe it's as developed. There may be people in the audience who have other views on.
Let's pursue that one step further, because last night Linda, my wife, and I were looking at belatedly at John McGavin's magnificent film on the oak tree, and the story of the way it nourishes, suffers, becomes emblematic of survival, or life itself and survival itself, of course, is then reproduced, if that's the right verb, it isn't exactly, in the Christian story of Christ dying on the cross for our redemption. And the strange thing is, I mean, that no one even now, and I'm not a Norse scholar, but I don't think anyone can make up their mind as to whether this is a matter of independent growth. And the myth of Odin on the tree developed independent of the Christian story of Christ on the cross. But many of you will know the great Anglo-Saxon poem, The Dream of the Rood, and that comes close in a way to the Norse, although it's Anglo-Saxon, sense of a tree that is glorious and shining and giving, and yet is also being ripped apart, rather like the oak is. So it's in a constant state of flux. What an image, what an image.
Are there any questions from the floor? Yes.
Do you think there's a case for adding Norse myths and Celtic myths to the religious studies area in national curriculum?
30 years ago, perhaps even a bit longer, the great Charles Keeping, the artist, who some of you will know, perhaps from your children or grandchildren, who had done The Highwayman and The Lady of Shalott, asked me if I'd like to join forces with him to do a version of Beowulf. We published in 1982, and at a time when everyone else was embarking on multicolour work, gravelly and stubborn that he was, Charles decided to go back to doing black and white and duotone pictures of great force. I remember then that I wrote long articles for the Times Educational Supplement and various other places, pleading that Anglo-Saxon studies and Old Norse should become part, well, let's put this more accurately, Anglo-Saxon history and Viking history should become part of the national curriculum. Not that there was a national curriculum then. Things move so slowly. And it is what's happened. Now they're an integral part of Key Stage 2. But they certainly weren't then. And of course, the likelihood is that there will be much more attention to our Norse inheritance, the Norse part of our inheritance, as a result of that educational gear shift. Do we think it's a good idea that there be more time given to them both?
Yes, well, of course, I'd be reluctant to make any policy pronouncements for recommendations for the UK government. But I think there's a great deal of value in what you say. Growing up in Wales, the Celtic mythology, certainly if you go to a Welsh medium school, is you take it for granted that is part of it. I mean, I was born in 1964, and I went to first of all an English medium school, then a Welsh medium school. This was entirely normal to be taught these stories, and you have them as your birthright, and it brings one's own history and one's own culture alive. So it is a pity, I always think, and I hope you don't detect too many traces of a primer in the presentation I give, but I think it is a pity that the Celtic history of these islands, the fact that the place we're living now would have been Celtic speaking, I mean England, before England was Celtic speaking, that there is little sense of that among the people of this country, little sense of it. So many of the place names, Dover, water, Avon, is the Welsh word for river. So when I drive down the M4 and I see River Avon, I think, river. You know, think of the history that's embodied in the fact that word is the Celtic word. I mean, that is the Welsh word for a river.
Actually, I do think that's a terrifically important question, this first question, because many of you will know who wrote these 10, 12 lines. In the coffered riches of grammar and declensions, I found barnhus. That means bone house. Its fire, benches, wattle and rafters, where the soul fluttered a while. In the roof space there was a small crock for the brain and a cauldron of generation swung at the centre. Loveden, Bloodholt, Dreambower. Well, of course, that's part of Seamus Heaney's Bone House. And what he's pointing to, and what your question has to imply, is that this is the story of our language, just as Graham was saying. And of course we should be engaging with it more, because it's not only the story of great literary edifices and moments, but actually of a developing language.
Okay. Any other questions? We have a microphone, actually, so if you just, there's one here. Stephen, there's one on the front. Just so everyone can hear what you're saying.
Oh, yes, hello. Do you think that the inventory of myths is limited to a pre-literary time, and it is something that cannot be added to in the present, or the myth, the need and process of myth-making is something that's part of being a human, and it is something that should be seen to be capable of continuing now in the present?
Are they set in aspic?
Gosh. Well, I'm possibly not enough of a student of mythology per se to know what one defines as myth and where the boundaries lie. I think there's an abiding need for heroes and tragedies, and people will invent them. People will turn the mundane events of their lives into stories with heroes, heroines, tricksters, and the like of people. There's an endless creativity among human beings generally, I think, which takes mythic patterns as its in order to shape experience, and that can be the micro experience of anecdotes that happen in your life, and people will apply to it heightened language, imagination, editing, stereotypes and the like, and sometimes the language of symbolism to describe it. So it can be at that level, and it can be at the level of entire societies, which will tell themselves foundation myths and sustaining myths, and will edit their history into acceptable patterns. So I think there's an abiding need for it, and it is happening around us and within us all the time.
Of course, I mean, myth is never the product of any one person or place or time. It's rather a sort of slow distilling and sifting, almost as you imagine sunlight cutting through a window into a room and the layers of dust gently coming down. George Steiner somewhere has had something very memorable to say about that. But in a way, it gives me an excuse to read these 6 lines again, which I do think are wonderful, from David Jones: to conserve, to develop, to bring together, to make significant for the present what past holds, without dilution or any deleting, but rather by understanding and transubstantiating the material. This is the function of genuine myth. Neither pedantic nor popularizing nor indifferent to scholarship, but always saying, of these thou hast given me, have I lost none. When you actually look at the myths, I mean, they are templates for human behavior in relation to whatever is beyond simple human understanding.
He uses the word past, but surely past isn't the only place that this can come from. It can come from anything which is true and eternal.
I mean, I think it must be a continuous process that's going on. But in the end, as likely as not, it comes back to love and betrayal and power and all the other great issues that have always preoccupied human beings.
I think that one of the tragedies is that the word myth in our present culture is read as a word that describes something which is old, when in fact, as Kathleen Raine, who founded the Temenos Academy, would often say, you know, they are eternal, and therefore they're in the present, and they enable us to look forward. So actually they're progressive.
And why are they eternal? Because they engage with the deepest longings of human beings.
Yes, yes. As she would put it, you know, not so much concerned with the politics of time, but the politics of eternity.
Yeah.
I always thought was a rather wonderful way of describing it. There's a question over there. Yeah.
Would it be too great a stretch to think of the word myth, which for some people is not so easy to understand or encompass, as a metaphor? Goethe said, "Alles Vergängnis ist ein Gleichnis." Everything we see is a metaphor. So a myth for some people is like a lie. It's a myth. It's not the truth. So would you
It's the same devaluing of the language.
would you
you're saying,
equalize
yes.
myth and metaphor?
As poets? Are you using myths or are you using metaphors?
Well, the very nature of being a poet is that one's dealing with association, making connections, and therefore using metaphor. But it's pushing it too far to say that therefore what one writes is mythical. This is a difficult question to get a handle on, because you're right. I mean, people regularly, as with so many other words, devalue the word myth. It's sort of very lightly used, whereas for us here it plainly has a much more layered meaning.
I think the question you raise of the relationship of myth to the truth, I think is very pertinent, and there's a great deal in that, because thinking back to what I said earlier about how we live myths and make myths all the time instinctively in our personal histories. For instance, we tell ourselves things about our lives in which we're heroes, victims, tricksters, whatever it might be. And the relationship, those myths can often be more powerful than any objective truth. So I think there's something there about the sheer power of myth and how it can be much, much more powerful than objective truths, again, both in the personal level and in the level of entire societies. I won't mention any examples because that would be provocative, but I think in principle, I think the myth can be, not always, truth can be acerbic and sobering and inspiring, but myth, rather troublingly, can be inspiring and sometimes more powerful than truth. And sometimes in a good way, not just in a bad way.
There's time for one more question, I think. Possibly. Any more questions before we come to a close? One more question, yes.
Thank you for a very beautiful presentation from both of you. I wonder whether, as poets and authors, you can comment on the differences between writing for the eye and writing for the ear.
Well, maybe we should ask the bard first from Wales.
Oh, right. Well, I write for the ear, definitely, and everything I write is designed to be understood at first hearing. And for me, if it isn't understood at first hearing, it hasn't worked. It's the way I write. It wasn't the way I began to write. I wrote initially for the page and for critics, but as I worked more with audiences, I realised the thrill of being able to connect with people, and consequently I try and have the language be as transparent as possible, and so consequently, yes, it's written to be heard in my case, but it's not the only way to write.
It was true of Thomas too, wasn't it, really?
Yes.
You wrote a critical book on Thomas?
Yes, indeed, yes. I didn't know him like you did, but our paths certainly
I
crossed.
don't think I certainly didn't claim to know him. I never dared call him by his Christian name.
I don't think anybody did.
Ah.
No, I know some people did. He did have that rather forbidding persona, didn't he?
But he also told me that he never revised a poem. That really did astonish me, because I'd sort of been brought up in the school of Robert Graves kind of thing, where you revised 15 or 20 times. And he said, well, no, you're in a state of heightened consciousness when you're writing, and you won't be able quite to enter or capture that moment. I still think that's suspect, but...
and what of this question of the spoken
I mean,
versus
certainly,
the...
as the son of a composer, but on the other hand, also as the son of a well-known potter, I perhaps revise too much, but I invariably write by hand, I revise, put away, come back to it, so it probably will be a year's worth. And as much as anything, it's the musical subtlety and balance that's important to me.
So the spoken becomes key rather than the written, which is the question.
It does.
Yeah.
Hearing it remains central to what I write. Yes. And that, of course, means what's not said, and the silence is between the words and so on. But that's true of you too.
I don't revise either. I would be with Thomas in that experience as well.
Wow.
And I'm not claiming the same quality, but the method is the same. Yeah. It's a state in which that poem's written, and I wouldn't return to it afterwards. It either works or it doesn't. So
there's a very distinguished poetry editor in this audience, and I'd like to ask him, if he cares to reply, whether in his experience with the authors he works with, most of them do revise and revise and revise, or
All the good ones do, I bet.
I think they're probably all revisers. There's one poet who is very well known to the Temenos Academy, Jeremy Reed, who usually tries to write in one go. And he's very prolific, and he's usually spot on. But it's my experience, it's very rare indeed, and so most of them, I would say, are revisers. And having occasionally seen Kevin's visually exciting manuscript books, I realize just how much work goes into that process for him, and indeed for many other poets.
When you say, right, do you mean revisiting, or because by revising I mean revisiting a poem after writing it, not the actual. I would have multiple drafts of it before I got to the final one, but I wouldn't revisit it. That's what I mean by revising.
I mean, it's interesting that Kathleen Rain, again, who, if you don't know her, founded Temenos. She told me once that only one poem came to her like that, and she was able just to write it down and never touched it again. It was. I can't remember. Sorry.
very interesting.
I can look it up for you, and there are probably people in this room who would know it. We're going to draw to a close now because we have to vacate this wonderful room by 8:30, and we thought that maybe you might want to just talk to Graham and to Kevin before the end of the evening, and possibly even purchase a book or two and have them sign it for you. So there's time for that. So I'd just like to, before we have the final moment, thank both of our speakers this evening. They've both given me a great deal of thought. I love that line. Was it everything? You have everything to look forward to. Was that the line that you? I think that's a rather wonderful point of hope somehow in this present age to hang on to. And I shall certainly take a good close look at Orion, which is very clear in the skies at the moment, and see if I can see the big toe that Kevin mentioned. Even the skies have come alive to me this evening. Kevin would just like to read one short poem before we finally end, but so perhaps he could do it first, and then we can say our final thank yous.
Yes, well, I thought I'd just invade Arthurian Celtic territory. The Blue from Heaven by Stevie Smith. King Arthur rode in another world, and his 12 knights rode behind him, and Guinevere was there, crying, "Arthur, where are you, dear?" Why is the king so blue? Why is he this blue colour? It is because the sun is shining and he rides under the blue cornflowers. High wave the cornflowers that shed the pale blue light, and under the tall cornflowers rides King Arthur and his 12 knights. And Guinevere is there, crying, "Arthur, where are you, dear?" First there were 12 knights riding, and then there was only one, and King Arthur said to the one knight, "Be gone." "All I wish for now," said Arthur, "is the beautiful colour blue, and to ride in the blue sunshine, and Guinevere, I do not wish for you." "O Lord," said Guinevere, "I do not see the colour blue, and I wish to ride where our knights rode, after you." Go back, Guinevere, go back to the palace," said the king. So she went back to the palace, and her grief did not seem to her a small thing. The queen has returned to the palace, crying, "Arthur, where are you, dear?" And every day she speaks of Arthur's grandeur to the knights who are there. That Arthur has fallen from the grandeur of his powers, all agree, and the falling off of Arthur becomes their theme presently. As if it were only temporarily, and it was not forever, they speak. But the queen knows he will come back never. Yes, Arthur has passed away. Gladly he has laid down his reigning powers. He has gone to ride in the blue light of the peculiar, towering cornflowers.
Kevin and Graham, thank you both very much.